All right, folks, we're going to get started. First off, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Pennsylvania Geologic Survey. For those of you tuning in from home, welcome to the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. My name is Al Giuseppe, and I'm a manager here at the survey. Thank you. And so we have a bit of a rowdy bunch here. So my apologies for those of you online that they may be making a lot of noise and throwing things. But I'm going to turn it over to our president, Kent Littlefield, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Al. Welcome, everybody, and welcome you all. It's been like 2.5 years since we had a presentation where we saw each other and got to talk to each other. And I really want to thank Gail and Al and Amy, mainly Gail, who said, yes, you can use the facility. Yes. And Al to arrange this and everything else, and Amy to put out the notices. And it's wonderful to be back in some normalcy and also have the convenience of you all who might want to tune in from Denver, Colorado, or wherever. Let's see. Also, I want to thank the speakers who've agreed to speak over the for the fall. Initially, Ellen here tonight. You'll hear from her tonight, and several others who've agreed to talk. And then this is the pitch for those of you who might have interest or have something they want to say, who would like to do a talk to HAGs. So it's a friendly audience. So throw your hat in. We need speakers for the spring. That's the main thing. So we'll get to business right now. Ellen Fehrs got her BS in geology at University of Pittsburgh and got her master's at Colorado School of Mines, where she studied dolomitization of the Bakken Formation in the Williston Basin. She's been here at the survey for about 3 years, doing computer-like stuff and mainly GIS and geology, melding GIS and geology. And she's been working with Kristen on carbonate banks and also obviously hydro stuff. So Ellen can take over. Thank you.
Yeah, and
For everyone in person, this is the time to silence your phones. It's been so long. We haven't had a warning about it.
Yeah.
and we started the recording.
Yes. There you go.
All right. Well, hi everyone. I am Ellen Fehrs, and I do in fact do computer type stuff here at the survey. I was hired in 2019 to work on a project focused on a statewide hydrography dataset, which we called the Pennsylvania Hydrography Dataset, or PAHD. And it's because of this project that I am giving a presentation today called Water Under the Bridge, a Practical Introduction to Hydrography in Pennsylvania. So, I might have to, okay. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be discussing this evening, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the evolution of hydrography, specifically in Pennsylvania. I'm going to discuss the methods that I use to produce hydrography and create some of these geometries. And at the very end, I'm also going to give some examples of hydrography application. So justifying why all of you as geologists should even care about this data. So in other words, I'm going to start out with kind of the history of hydrography in our state. I'm going to go into the science and the more technical aspects of working with this data. And I'm going to round it out with a combination of history, science, and nitpicking this data. So before I get into kind of the history of it all, I do want to touch briefly on some vocabulary. And this was actually a point of discussion during the pre-reception meeting, so I thought that was kind of cool. But there is a difference between the words hydrography, hydrology, and hydrogeology. I think sometimes some of these words can be used a little bit interchangeably. If you talk to any one of my coworkers, I've heard all of these words used in reference to my project. And depending on how you're talking about it, I don't think it's necessarily incorrect, but I typically refer to this work as generating hydrography. Hydrography having the Greek suffix for right. So it's coming more from a cartographic standpoint. And because I'm in GIS, I just think that's appropriate. Hydrology, and I know you all know this is kind of elementary school review, but hydrology, having the Greek suffix for study, is more of a focus on the water itself. And hydrogeology is obviously looking at the interaction between water and rock. And I did think I was being kind of clever here by saying geology is English for geology, but I only heard like 2 laughs, so maybe it wasn't that clever. Okay, so going into the background of this, another kind of disclaimer I want to put here, I might use the phrase stream, and I don't know, it's a very loaded term. So not everything I show you is going to be a stream, but just for ease of communication, if I say stream when I mean flow path or flow line, I am going to ask you to forgive me. But I wanted to give a little background on hydrography in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania has a really long, really interesting history of hydrography. And I wanted to start with one of the oldest, coolest examples I could find was George Washington's map. He hand drew this map of the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela. And this was drawn during the French and Indian War. And I think it's kind of dated by some of these fun spellings. If you look at the spelling for Yakahani, like that's kind of what my brain does whenever I am called upon to spell it. Another thing you might notice, he did call the Allegheny River the Ohio River, but I think we can forgive him for that because I wanted to take a quick peek at like how accurate some of this hydrography was for not having had any technology. So I decided to georeference it. And this is just straight up rubber sheeting. This is not anything elegant, but I started out with one control point at the intersection at the base of the Ohio. I added a second control point to kind of the southeast at the junction of Turtle Creek. And I added a third control point to the northwest where French Creek tributary comes out. And this is the best I've ever gotten this map to look georeferenced, so I kind of just decided to stop there. But I thought it was really interesting and cool how well this actually lines up with what we would expect to see. The Allegheny Mountains do appear to match, despite the interesting spelling, and the major water features do align pretty well. I know there's a lot of foreshortening in one direction, but I was just really impressed with George Washington's surveying ability. And the next major, I guess, in my mind, advent in Pennsylvania hydrography came about with Howard Higbee, who was a soil scientist at the Pennsylvania State University. Despite being a soil scientist, he devoted a lot of time towards mapping hydrography in Pennsylvania. He actually hand drew a statewide hydrography map based on a combination of topographic maps and aerial photography. He spent 30 years working on the statewide hydrography map. It was kind of his magnum opus. And he even modified his car's odometer so it would read miles by the 500th. And he would like drive along streams to make sure the relative lengths of all these streams were accurate. So this is the map he produced when he produced it with about 45,000 miles of Pennsylvania streams. And he was, at the time, this was a beloved map by fishermen. It picked out a lot of tributaries that had been at this point previously unmapped. So he ordered about 70,000 copies of this map to be produced. Unfortunately, after 70,000 copies were produced, disaster struck, which is a very dramatic way of saying the printers went bankrupt. But this was especially devastating because he gave them the only copy of his stream map. When they went bankrupt, they destroyed it. And this was unfortunate because all 70,000 copies were printed with something called non-photographic blue, which, if you are not familiar, non-photographic blue, at the time, there weren't any printers essentially that could pick up this hue of blue. And even today, this color is really popular for illustrators. They'll flesh out sketches and get rid of the color in kind of digital editing. So because all these streams were printed using this color, it was impossible to copy any of these 70,000 maps. Now, because of that, these existing maps became extremely valuable. And I found a lot of kind of neat stories on the internet. I don't know how true some of these are, if I'm being honest. Some of this might be a little bit urban legend. But I did find an article about a very contentious divorce where two fisher people were fighting over their copy of the Higby map. And the wife, who was a pretty established angler, actually walked away with the map, which I'm a lady, so I was kind of biased towards her anyway. I thought it was kind of a good story. I found another reference to the sale of a house where the closing contract was contingent upon the house including the Higby map in the sale. So apparently these things were just extremely valuable. And that scarcity lasted up until the 1990s when two gentlemen named Larry Seaman and Carl Ings began looking into ways to copy some of these existing maps. So they actually were able to reach out to a printing company that had developed some relatively new technology that was able to produce copies of non-photographic blue. And so they put in an initial order for 10,000 copies for $10,000. And for this initial order, they were actually told by the company to reconsider and that this order was probably too big. That did not end up being the case. This order was put in sometime, I think it was in December, and they were sold out by spring. So it was a pretty good investment, and it continued to be a good investment even today. So this story kind of has a happy ending because Higby thought that 30 years of work put into the statewide hydrography map was just completely destroyed, but it was restored before he passed away at the age of 93 years old. And he was able to form a connection with these two gentlemen who were able to make copies of his maps, and he was able to pass out on some of his map making methodology to Seaman and Ings. So while all this was going on, all this Higby drama, the EPA began compiling a data set of reach files in the 1970s. So if you're not familiar with the term reach, it refers to like individual, for lack of a better word, stream segments. And this data set, when it was first released, was produced at a 1 to 500K scale. As it evolved, the third version came out at a 1 to 100K scale. I tried to look into the background of how this data was refined and edited, and it is incredibly murky, very cloak and dagger. I don't know how they improved this data, and I'm a little bit suspicious because it was produced from a hanging wall map that was originally at a 1 to 2.5 million scale. So I'm not saying the data isn't accurate. I just, it would be nice if there was a little bit more of a background to how this data came to be. And this is a good thing to be cognizant of because this data served as the basis for the USGS's National Hydrography Dataset. So if you're not familiar with the National Hydrography Dataset, it is the national equivalent to essentially the project I'm working on. It is a countrywide hydrography dataset. It has multiple versions as they kind of added attribution and improved the geometries. The most recent version of the NHD is called the NHD plus high resolution, or the NHD plus HR. And I have kind of a production map shown here. And as you can see, pretty much everything that's in blue is currently considered beta version, which is interesting because this data set they plan to discontinue it towards the end of this year. That is, they will no longer be accepting edits or updates, and it will be maintained as an archival data set, which is not to say that this is the last version of the NHD. There will be a next greatest and latest version of the NHD. So just to give you kind of a synopsis, the way the evolution of this data kind of played out is we started with the reach file data set from the EPA in the 1970s. It kind of switched hands and evolved into the NHD. We are currently on the NHD plus high res, and the next iteration of, I don't want to call it the NHD, it's not going to be called an NHD. The NHD, they don't really have a title for the data set yet, but the name of the program is 3D Hydrography Program, so 3D HP. And the concept of that data set kind of brings me to my project, which is also elevation-derived hydrography. And as I said, I started working on this project in 2019. And when I started working here, it was conceived with kind of three basic requirements. One, that this data be accurate to a 1 to 2400 scale. Two, that these geometries have Z values. So I'm producing 3D geometries. And three, that this be a dynamic data set. So this data set is never intended to stagnate. As new cycles of lidar are flown, the geometries in this data set will be updated to reflect those changes. So this is a production map, and I actually have my old boss sitting in the crowd, so I don't like showing it because I haven't gotten as much done as I would have liked since he retired. But having said that, this is what I have produced to date. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why maybe my rate of production hasn't been as ideal as I would have liked. But I do want to show some of these areas of interest in the context of the major river basins, because in the next few slides, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting some of my data with the NHD. And I'm going to be looking at the three major river basins, the Ohio, the Susquehanna, and the Delaware. So starting in the Ohio, this is in Allegheny County. On the left, I'm showing PAHD in orange. On the right, the NHD, the most current version of the NHD is shown in pink. I think immediately one of the most obvious differences is that there are quite a few of these smaller tributary features that are visible in the underlying hillshade, which are not represented by NHD, but which are picked up by PAHD methods. Likewise, if we look at the features that are present in the NHD, you can see there's a certain amount of offset from where we would expect to see those channelized features, as opposed to PAHD, which does not have that offset. Moving over into the Susquehanna River Basin, this is an example from Dauphin County, and I chose this example because a really important application for this data that I'm going to discuss more of it later is using this data to actually edit elevation surfaces. Using this data to edit those surfaces is somewhat contingent on accurate placement of features like culverts and bridges. So in this example, if we look at the NHD on the right, kind of in the downstream most extent, we can see it doesn't do the worst job of representing this crossing at this road feature. But as we work our way up, we can see that where this flow feature is crossing underneath this highway, there's a pretty substantial amount of offset between where that feature should be and where the NHD places it. And when I measured it, this offset was over 50 meters. So this isn't like an insubstantial inaccuracy. Whereas with PAHD, when I edit these culverts for 3D application purposes, I have to do a lot of that work manually. So as a result of that, it's inherently going to match the hillshade a lot better. Also, there's actually a second crossing point that the NHD failed to pick up completely. And this is the last kind of compare and contrast example I wanted to show. This is from the Delaware River Basin in Berks County. And this is actually an instance where I don't think the NHD was necessarily spatially inaccurate, but I think this is evidence of temporal inaccuracy because the NHD, a lot of the geometries present are based on topo maps from like the 1970s and 1980s. And a lot of the geometries, sometimes somebody will slightly alter the attribution. So the edit date or the last edit date of that geometry may be 2012, but the actual geometry hasn't changed since like it was first digitized, which isn't ideal. But that's kind of what I think is going on here. If we look at the hillshade, there's this kind of meandering feature. So I don't think it's inconceivable that originally the NHD may have accurately portrayed this feature, but then it migrated over time. But because the NHD isn't well suited to updates, PAHD is just always going to do a better job of conforming to the hillshade because it's generated from the most recently available elevation data. And I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about how it is generated from that data. So this is kind of a flyby overview of the most recent iteration of my workflow. A lot of this workflow is kind of centered around the concept of geomorphons or geomorphon analysis. And if you are not familiar, a geomorphon is a landform classification system wherein you start with an elevation surface, so a DEM. You enter the raster into software. The software will go through the raster one cell at a time, analyze that cell and the surrounding cells, and depending on the shape the surface of those surrounding cells forms, it will assign that central cell one of 10 landform types, which is what we're looking at here. This is a geomorphon output, and as you can see, quite a lot of it has been assigned the yellow slope classification. But even before I bring up orthoimagery, you can already start to pick out some recognizable features. Like again, with that meandering pattern, I think that's a pretty classic hydrography feature. So at this point, what I do is I pull out those classes that are most strongly associated with hydrography features. And oh, I forgot I had this. Yeah, so we have some orthoimagery. We can confirm that the meandering feature is a flow feature. And when we pull out those cells that are associated with hydrography features, unfortunately, it doesn't just pull out hydrography features. It also picks up signatures from a lot of other features. So if we look at this image, while it does do a pretty good job of picking out and accurately picking out some of these flow features, it also picks out a lot of anthropogenic features, like we can see some road structures being picked up here. There's quite a lot of these little agricultural rills that are being picked up. If we look kind of in the floodplain, we might see some noisy data. So at this point in the workflow, my goal is to retain as much of those hydrographic signatures as I can while winnowing out the noisy data. So I do that by producing 3 different geomorphon products. And I'm not going to go into detail here. I want the focus to remain on the one I just showed you, which is the channel extent geomorphon. But essentially what I'm doing by creating these other 2 products is I'm going to apply them as masks. So they're going to kind of act as cookie cutters. And these other rasters are going to bit by bit snip out sections of data that I am not interested in. Before I do that, I do some connectivity calculations. Because looking at these products, there's a pretty strong correlation in all these clumps of cells between the number of cells in a group and whether or not it is likely to be representative of a hydrographic feature. So I will pick a cell grouping threshold, and it can change quite a lot depending on the local topography and just the environment in general. If it's a very urban area, this is incredibly difficult to apply a good threshold to. But in this case, I chose a cell threshold of about 2,500 cells. So in the image on the right, everything shown in red, those are groups of cells that include at least 2,500 cells. Everything shown in yellow has less than that amount, and I have elected to discard all of that data. So I will apply that connectivity calculation to these products, and then I will mask them against each other. So again, it's kind of like functioning like a cookie cutter. If you look at these three rasters stacked up on top of each other, again, the focus is the blue raster, that channelized product. But anywhere that all three rasters are not overlapped, that data is going to be discarded. And this is what that looks like. The blue is the channelized Geomorphon product prior to the masking. The orange is what it looks like after the masking. And as you can see, like I said, it did get rid of a lot of that anthropogenic data, the stuff picked up in the farmlands and some of this road data. Now, unfortunately, it didn't get rid of all the bad stuff. It actually also got rid of some pretty good looking lines. Like I would have liked to retain that segment, and some of the connectivity in here has been lost. So this whole portion of the workflow is kind of a balancing act between getting rid of as much of the bad stuff as I can while retaining as much of the good stuff as possible. So what I'm left with are all these little orange lines, all these little disarticulated segments, and I want them to connect up in a nice cohesive network. So I perform something called least cost analysis. And I do this by creating a cost surface using the original DEM. And that's the image shown here on the right-hand side. So this is a DEM that has been modified. And essentially anywhere you see those really dark cells, those are considered areas of very low cost. So when I enter these two products, the orange lines and, sorry about that, and the cost surface into the software, I can tell the software to force connections between all these line segments along areas of low cost. So it's kind of like the concept of path of least resistance. So if I want to connect the line segment right here to the downstream component, the software is going to go along these paths of least cost. And the output of that looks like this, the green lines on the left. And as you can see, it did an all right job, but it still needs quite a lot of cleaning up. I really doubt that this line segment flows uphill before flowing back downhill and like connecting up with the network. So at this point of the workflow, it's kind of the stop of that semi-automation, and it's where the manual work starts. So I have to clean up these lines to kind of reflect what I think is going on in the system. I also have to add things like attribution for culverts, and this is something I alluded to earlier, but individually digitizing culverts and attributing them as such is really helpful for different modeling purposes because it allows you to isolate those features and apply them to the elevation surface. And I want to show an example of that here. Looking at the hillshade, you can see there's this road feature coming through. I apologize, it's really difficult to see in the ortho imagery. But if you are applying a modeling technique like flow accumulation, which I'm going to discuss more at a later point, the software, if it's trying to model how water is flowing based on some potentiometric surface, when it looks at this elevation surface, it doesn't know that the water is flowing under the bridge, so to speak. As far as the software can tell, this is an artificial barrier structure, so it's going to be dammed up. And that's why I have to manually add these culvert features. So here are the hillshades from the DEM prior to applying that editing and after having edited it. And as you can see, the difference here is that area where that artificial barrier structure, or where the water was crossing the artificial barrier structure, has been compressed. And here are two profiles of the flow path shown here. You can see what the barrier structure looks like. And this is what the software interprets the surface as being. It interprets water as flowing down the surface, coming to a barrier and getting dammed up. But after having edited that surface, you can see that that barrier structure has been removed. And obviously, this is not a cartographic product, but it can be very useful for modeling purposes. Now, another application of manual edits comes when I have to make interpretations about connectivity. And this is the part of the talk I don't want to talk about because it's the most contentious aspect of some of this data. When it comes to figuring out how some of these lines connect, I don't always have information about what's going on in the subsurface, or that is, I don't always have enough information to make a good interpretation. One example of this is in urban areas. Sometimes there is MS4. That has not been my experience. It's been very difficult for me to find MS4. So there are basically two schools of thought when it comes to imposing connectivity. You can either force connectivity when you don't know what's going on in the subsurface, and that's what's going on in the left-hand image with the NHD shown in pink and with some lines that I produced shown in orange. And some people prefer this. Even if this isn't an accurate reflection of where the water is moving, this can be very useful for things like flow calculations. The other school of thought is that we should only be showing these lines where we have surficial data telling us where the water is flowing. And that's what's going on in the right-hand image showing this Allegheny County data. Like Allegheny County, I'm sure they are aware that these flow features, I apologize, by the way, I'm having a little bit of trouble with this mouse. I'm very sure that Allegheny County is aware that these tributaries somehow, some way match up with this double line stream down here, but they didn't want to make a false interpretation just for modeling purposes. Another environment where sometimes I have to deal with connectivity issues are if sections of the network are connected to the overall network by ephemeral or intermittent features. Depending on how permanent or not permanent some of these features are, these channels, there might not be channels. It might not be reflected in the elevation data. So I may be called upon to make an interpretive connection. And the last one I wanted to touch on in this presentation is karst. And I think this is probably the most difficult environment to interpret and the one that starts the most arguments with the Usgs. So this example is from Mifflin County. I have the bedrock pulled up, and if we look at the major lithology, we can see that there's this whole carbonate swath coming through this area. And there is quite a lot of disconnectivity. And if we look at some of these flow paths, again, these are orange, so these are PAHD lines that I have generated. I would be pretty comfortable connecting something like this little isolated network to the downstream component, because I can see a certain amount of there's a certain depression in the hillshade. I think that's enough evidence to suggest that this is connected. However, if we look in the kind of southwestern area, there is this one little flow path that leads right to a sinkhole. And I have absolutely no idea how that water connects to the overall system. And I mean, it's very likely it does connect to the system at large, but I don't know that for sure. And I won't know that or how it connects unless I perform a dye trace test. So I am more comfortable leaving that component of the system unconnected. So that's kind of a drive-by overview of the workflow I've been using for the past about year and a half to produce some of these geometries. I do have a few kind of mission statements that go with this approach. The goal of PAHD is to produce a more agile system of updates than what is currently available with the NHD. It's also intended to kind of empower data producers at the state level, as well as county and municipal levels. And ultimately, I hope to get these updates into, I shouldn't say I hope, I will get these updates into the next iteration of the NHD, whatever that iteration looks like. And I do want to round off this presentation with some examples of a hydrographic application to kind of maybe hopefully wake up some of the hardcore geologists in the audience. So why use PAHD as opposed to something like the NHD? I think I have shown that PAHD is just inherently spatially and temporally more accurate, and more accurate hydrography means better geologic maps. It doesn't necessarily mean more accurate geologic interpretations, but I do think it results in better maps. And it also results in more accurate attribution, which again, this is kind of dependent on the geologist in question, but more accurate attribution can lead to more accurate geologic interpretation. Also, it just acts as a much better field aid. If you're trying to find something like outcrop exposed by stream beds, it's generally pretty helpful to know where the streams are. So one of these applications, geologic maps, I wanted to give an example of how hydrography can improve a geologic map. And I chose this example for a few reasons. It has a hill shade, so you can see what the elevation data, what story the elevation data is telling. It also utilizes the most recent version of the NHD. Also, it's New York, so I'm hoping that anything I say isn't offensive to anyone in the audience. But if we want to look at this, I do also, again, want to reiterate, nothing I'm saying here is in reference to the geologic interpretation here. I'm more looking at what story the geologic interpretation is telling compared to what the hydrography of the base map is saying. So if we zoom into this area, you can see the hill shade a little bit better. Oh yeah, you guys can see it on the screen. You can see in the hill shade, there are some pretty obvious channelized features that suggest the presence of tributaries. This is backed up by the formation of the contours. It's even backed up by the fingering that we see here from the lithologic units. And if we look at these lithologic units, specifically this light blue unit, it is interpreted as having been deposited by rivers and streams. And I absolutely agree with this. I think these three sets of data back one another up. The hill shade, the contours, and the formation of the units appear to say that there is some kind of tributary feature coming down here. Unfortunately, that is not reflected in the hydrography that we see. And if we look at the hydrography that is present, again, this is the NHD, the features that do exist don't even do the best job of conforming to the channelization we see in the hillshade. So this doesn't make the geology wrong, but it's kind of like when you are reading a report and you have a figure and a caption, and the figure and the caption don't quite match. It doesn't necessarily make the interpretation wrong, but it's not as effective at communicating the context of the story. So another example I wanted to show of where the NHD is just not suitable for our needs is in Allegheny County. I'm currently doing a conflation study in Allegheny County, so I kind of have a bunch of examples from Allegheny County. And I have pointed out Interstate 79 on this image just to help you orient yourself in the following slides. But looking here, all these lines shown on the hillshade are NHD flow lines, and I have color coded them according to feature type. So you can see I have 3 different streams here going from perennial to intermittent to ephemeral. And I kind of tried to match the permanence with the degree to how pink it is. So the pinker lines are more permanent, the less pink is less permanent. In this study area, there's also a connector feature, and I'm not honestly very interested in the connector feature. So if you want to pretend it's not there, that's honestly kind of ideal. But looking at this image, I am most interested in this flow line coming down here. You can see there's an offset to its complementary channel in the hillshade, and this is an offset that's hundreds of meters in length. Not only that, if you look at this feature, I'm not going to call these mountains, but there are at least 2 significant topographic highs where this feature is just slicing across them. So I think this is spatially incredibly inaccurate. And as I was looking at this area, I kind of zoomed out a bit and I noticed something a little bit strange. On the west side of the interstate, I was seeing instances where perennial features were coming down flowing into intermittent features. And that's not necessarily wrong. I'm not saying it is wrong, but I thought it was strange that immediately on the other side of the highway, you could see the opposite, where there are intermittent features coming down into perennial features. And I just kind of wanted to understand why this was. When I pulled up just like a very brief scan of the geology, I saw a whole bunch of shale. I didn't think that really gave me any additional information. So I decided to zoom out even farther. So right now I'm showing you this data at a 1 to 37,500 scale. I zoomed out by a few orders of magnitude. And looking at this image, the blue navy square shows the extent from the previous slide. And looking at this data, I noticed that the intermittent and perennial features were really starting to clump together. So to kind of just orient myself, I brought up the outline of a quad map. And I immediately noticed there's a very strong correlation between how these features are identified and the presence of these quads. So I am pretty sure what happened is some consultants were paid to go through these geometries 1 quad at a time and assign all these features, these feature codes. And I actually have a working theory that there were at least 3 people working on this data. There was 1 person who only liked intermittent features. There was 1 person who only liked perennial features. And there was 1 person kind of in the middle who was willing to pay lip service to both types of features. So my next question was, this is obviously not what the water is doing. So is this kind of bias constrained to Allegheny County, or is this present throughout the state? And so I decided to look at the data set on a statewide level. Shown here, all these pink lines, these are all the NHD flow lines that overlap the state of Pennsylvania. I did a quick pie chart to see kind of what the breakdown of the different feature types was. And you can see the vast majority of these features are identified as either an intermittent feature or a perennial feature. So then I went in and I pulled out all the geometries that had a perennial identifier or an intermittent identifier. And it looks something like this. So that kind of blocky quad by quad identification approach continued on a statewide level. And when I've talked to data producers from other states, including Indiana and California, this application of, they're called feature codes or F codes. It's present at, we're pretty sure, a countrywide level. I haven't talked to everybody from every state, but we've got at least a team of Pennsylvania, Indiana, and California, and we're all on team blocky, so that doesn't bode well for the NHD. So one thing I hope to do to address this, and this isn't something I've done yet, it's kind of a work in progress. Oh, I do want to talk about applications for a second. This is bad. Inaccurate attribution is really inopportune for applications like FEMA flood insurance rate maps. if you are at all familiar with stream stats. And as I've explained at length, base maps for geologic maps, all of these applications rely on accurate attribution. So I hope to address that by kind of semi-automating the way some of these features are identified. And I hope to do that by using flow accumulation, which is a modeling technique I mentioned earlier when I was talking about editing in Culverts. And just to give a quick explanation for folks who might not be familiar with flow accumulation, it's a modeling technique that in some ways is similar to geomorphon analysis. You start with a DEM, which I'm showing here. This is a very simplified cartoon of a DEM. You enter it into the software, and the software can go through one pixel at a time, analyze that pixel and the surrounding cells, and depending on the elevation of these surrounding cells, it will choose a direction in which water is likely to flow. And it's always going to choose the lowest elevation available. So for this cell in the upper left-hand corner, it's going to flow to the cell kind of towards the center of the raster. That cell is again going to continue down to the lower right-hand corner, so on and so forth. And this kind of logic can be applied to every single cell in the raster. So the software will go through and assign every single cell a flow direction. And then once every cell has been assigned a flow direction, you can begin to assign flow accumulation values. And a flow accumulation value is just how many cells are flowing into that cell. So if we look at the cell in the lower right-hand corner, how many cells are flowing into that? I count 1, 2, 3, 4. None of the other cells that we see at this extent are going to make it into this cell. So that cell has a flow accumulation value of 4. And once all the cells have been assigned flow accumulation values, you can begin to define, and I'm going to use big quotes here, stream features. I don't think this is a great way to accurately delineate streams, but that's kind of the terminology used by the most popular software. So you can pick a flow accumulation threshold, and it can be any value. I can pick a value of 0, and that would qualify all the pixels in my cartoon as being stream features. That's generally not the most accurate approach. So people typically pick like a higher value than 0. In this case, I'd probably pick something like a flow accumulation value of 4. And that way, everywhere a pixel has a value of 4, it's going to define, again, big quotes, a stream feature. And this is not a great way to accurately produce these geometries, but it is a good way of defining flow path extents. So if we start with a relatively high flow accumulation threshold, this geometry is not going to be initiated very far upstream. And as we lower that threshold, as we lower the requirement, the geometry is going to be delineated farther and farther upstream. It's even going to pick out some of these smaller tributary features. So in the example shown, I don't think some of these are very accurate at all. I don't think the lowest value is the most accurate. But what I'm interested in is how these flow accumulation values define extents. So I don't think this is applicable necessarily to this area. This is all hypothetical. But if we look at the upper extent of this green line to the lower extent, maybe we could identify that as a ephemeral feature. If we look at the upper extent of the pink line to the upper extent of the orange line, maybe that could coincide with intermittent features. And then the lowermost extent could be associated with perennial features. And especially where I am now, I do not think this is an accurate way to pick out these features and differentiate them. It's kind of a working method. I think the big benefit of this is that it is unbiased and it is consistent, which I think is an improvement over the data we currently have. Also, this is very much contingent on refining some of these values depending on local topography, and it is extremely dependent on the data brought back by field mappers. I think as field mappers bring back more information about what is identifiable as an intermittent or even ephemeral feature, this methodology can be additionally fine-tuned. And that's kind of the philosophy behind this data set. It is intended to be improved with time. So the last application that I wanted to touch on, again, is field work. This covers things like water sampling, dye trace tests. And like I said earlier, if you're looking for outcrop exposed by stream beds, all of these things necessitate accurate hydrography. Well, they don't necessitate it if you don't mind wandering around in the woods for a while until you happen upon a stream, but accurate hydrography can really improve your experience. So that brings me back to this production map, and I think, I hope my explanation of my current workflow has kind of explained why I haven't produced hydrography for the entire state yet. A lot of manual work goes into this, and I do think it's worth it. I do think this data is high quality and is going to make for better application purposes. So kind of in summary, my main takeaways from this are, I want you to know that Pennsylvania has a really long, really cool history of hydrography production. It's something I encourage all of you to check out. Like the one map I showed by George Washington, he produced a bunch of maps. They're really interesting. You should definitely look them up. I also want to emphasize that my whole methodology is focused on picking out channelized structures. So this is very much superficial interpretation. To some extent, maybe there's some subsurface interpretation, but for the most part, that is not my focus. And finally, I said this before, I'll say it again, I think my data is both spatially and temporally more accurate than the NHD. And before I open up the floor to questions, I wanted to go back one more time to Howard Higbee. As I said earlier, he was a soil scientist. In fact, his most popular publication was the land resource map of Pennsylvania, showing a bunch of different soil types. It was the most highly distributed, I shouldn't say was, it is the most highly distributed for purchase PSU publication in the history of PSU. That's incredible. And the fact that the focus of his career was on soils, he was asked before, why do you spend so much of your time and energy in mapping water? And he says it is because water affects soil, and it also affects rocks, and that's why you guys should care about it. So that's my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. If you are online, please drop your questions in the chat. Al is going to let me know what you say, but yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Ellen. Very interesting talk, and I agree with you about the accuracy of the maps needs to be the best that can be done. And again, you very close to the end of your talk, you got to some of my questions that I had as I was going along. Was how does this affect stream stats, which is a well-used program, and even more is FEMA and flood insurance. It's going to make a difference to what people pay.
Yeah.
And that's going to be even more important.
Yeah.
So the question how will this information backfeed to some of those programs? Will it, or is it a one-way flow?
It is my plan that it will. Currently, those applications are based around federally recognized data. So the NHD. My goal is to get my data into the NHD. And the NHD, yeah, for those of you, yeah, I'll smash it in with a hammer.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't work with the NHD a lot, they recently announced the discontinuation of the NHD stewardship program. That is not to say we can't get updates and edits into the NHD, but this is very much a time of transition at the USGS. So the key to getting a lot of these applications to recognize my geometries is getting my geometries into the next iteration of the NHD. And I was not, for the record, I know this whole presentation kind of came off as I hate the NHD. That is not the case. Yeah, it's an incredible data set. It's more that this is why it needs to change, and this is why more effort needs to be put into it. So I hope that answers your question. Essentially, I'm going to get updates into those applications through the NHD or the next iteration of it.
And Ellen always neglects to point out that we are working very closely with the USGS.
Yeah,
We talked to the to the Steve Achel, who actually runs the.
Yes.
He's I don't know, I never know what their titles are, but he's very much in charge of this 3DHP program.
You're probably thrilled with it.
And we're tight.
Oh yeah, we are. I apologize. I'm so bad at being diplomatic to the USGS. The folks we work with are awesome, and they're very open to conversations. A lot of these arguments that I've heard have been kind of in the context of USGS discussions of particularly how connectivity in karst settings should be applied. So the USGS, there are lines in the sand. Like some folks are all for the modeling and some folks are all for like dye trace tests. We'll see how it shakes out. Yep.
First of all, really, really excellent. Super, super interesting talk and presentation and all of that.
Thanks.
I noticed that you selected locations for your modeling like all across the state. Did you do that for statewide variability, or like what was your process in choosing your modeling locations?
Yeah, when I first started, I was trying to represent a variety of geologic settings, but I was looking at a lot of stuff, geology, land cover, and like drainage patterns. And I wanted to see how this methodology would work in each of these settings. I gave you all kind of a simplified overview of the workflow, but depending on which setting you're in, some of these parameters can change. So I chose all those settings because I was trying to break the workflow. I was trying to identify weaknesses. Yeah.
Yeah, the lidar data that they're collecting help you identify what is and isn't streamed and so forth.
Yeah, so we're very lucky. We have QL2, quality level 2 lidar, so 1 meter resolution DEMs for the entire state. We're incredibly lucky. I just got out of a meeting today with the USGS where New York is way, way, way behind in getting QL2 coverage. But the resolution is so fantastic. It makes picking out a lot of these features, I don't want to say easy. Depending on the setting, it can be very easy. In forested areas, it's very easy to pick out some of these features using the elevation data. In urban areas, it is incredibly difficult. Yeah.
All right, we have some questions online. Alexander asked, do you have to look at the water features at different times of the year? Do they change with the seasons?
That's a really good question. What my workflow produces doesn't change with the seasons because I'm using lidar that was flown during leaf off. So it's pretty much fall all the time, all day, every day. But something that's really important, and I haven't been able to spend enough time on, is that a lot of my geometries, I will put the initiation point of a flow path where the channel ends. And that is not necessarily representative of where this water is initiating from. And these initiation points can migrate vast distances depending on the topography and the time of the year. I haven't done a lot of field work, but that would be a really good application for that because where some of these lines initiate is dependent on the time of the year.
All right, another question from Tom. Are your data lines directionalized vectors or are they connected rasters?
I think he's being funny. I don't know, but I'm gonna pretend it's a serious question and answer it. All my lines are digitized, so every vertex in a line has an elevation value that's been pulled directly from the underlying DEM. So based on that, I have it set so all my lines flow from uphill to downhill, which is ideal. But in some of these really complex networks, where there are very short line segments with not a lot of change in vertical elevation, sometimes the lidar, which is accurate, I think it's to about 10 centimeters vertically, sometimes that's not accurate enough to correctly have it flowing from uphill to downhill, if that makes sense. So there's a certain amount of error, and some of those flow directions in my lines, I do have to manually correct. So hopefully that answered that question. And if that was a serious question, I apologize. I just don't know what he's talking about.
Any other questions? We have some comments I'd like to, yeah, go ahead.
So, with the delineation,
Mhm.
has there been any thoughts on like the possibility of using any machine learning
Yes.
to do that?
Yeah, that would be really cool. We don't currently have an image analyst license, and we just got our budgets in, and I didn't think to budget for it, but actually machine learning, I think, has a big potential for application here, because a lot of what I do is go through and say, okay, that's a real flow path, or okay, well, that's an ATV trail that should not be included. And I think it would be not easy, but feasible to teach a machine how to recognize those differences. Yeah. And I think that would be so cool. That would make my job so much easier if I figured it out. That's the big if.
Questions? We have some comments from online. Jay says, excellent job. We've come a long way. Benjamin says, very nice, Ellen. Hail to Pitt.
Yeah.
Amy says, lots of great examples of the proverbial saying that the devil is in the details. This is a monumental task for your effort and superb presentation. This says, good info, thank you. And oh, and then Tom responded, yeah, you answered his question.
Oh, cool.
They are.
Okay, nice. Did you have a question?
You had a map.
Yes.
And you explained very nicely that the little blue spots that were your study areas
Yes.
were areas of interest that perhaps represented different test model areas, which we can all understand why you do that. I guess my next question is, would it be reasonable to think about prioritizing your next set of study areas to areas, again, where there's big influences for flooding?
Absolutely.
You know, FEMA flooding, design of flood control, things of that nature.
Yeah, well,
which means, again, urban.
Yeah, urban, I actually, I think around the time I first started working, I was directed by multiple people to maybe not focus so much on urban because it's a smaller portion of the state and I'm trying to get as much coverage as quickly as possible. Having said that, I think that is a good point about prioritizing some of these study areas. The ways that I have approached picking out study areas in the past are, honestly, we'll have like a yearly hydrography workshop and we'll have partners from the county and municipal level, and pretty much whatever people have interest in, that's kind of what I flowed with. But looking at flood applications, I think that could be interesting. The other point about urban hydrography is that there are two projects going on, one in Philadelphia and one in Pittsburgh. And I don't have any part in that, but they are consolidating available MS4 and they are trying to derive some of these lines. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, they kind of do the work for me and I can just like conflate it into my data set. I can't obviously hang my hat on that forever, but that's kind of what I'm hoping for. Yep.
What is MS4?
MS4. Oh gosh, what are the 4 S's? Sewers.
Municipal sewer,
Separate sewer.
separate sewer, okay.
Yeah. I thought there were 4 S's, like sewer, storm.
You're right.
Yeah.
Missed an S.
I don't remember the S's. I'm sorry. I have to Google it.
I understand what they say.
Yeah. So basically, it's like urban drainage.
EPA required,
Mhm.
forced on the municipalities with no money to pay for it.
Yeah, and everybody has their MS4 stored in different areas, and I'm glad I don't have to deal with it, at least currently in my job.
Well, no more questions online. Here. Thank you,
Very good,
Alan.
Alan. Thank you.
All right, for those of you here, don't forget to sign in. As you walked in the door, there was a little sign-in sheet. Next month, we have a visitor from USGS who's gonna come up here and say all bad things about PA. No, it's not. No, great speaker. His name's Alan Pitts. He's gonna be coming up here from Western Virginia. So for those of you online and those of you here, you guys are welcome to join us in this viewing party. Or if you can't make it to Middletown, you can tune in online.
Will he be here in person?
Yes, right now, Alan's intending on coming up. So this is one of the nice things that if something happens and he's unable to make it, he's just going to, zoom in and we'll still get benefit of his presentation. All right, I'm concluding the meeting then.
Thank you.
That means we're gonna have to pay for gas again.
But it's getting so much cheaper.